Good evening and welcome to this evening's Lundy webinar, the second in our new series of talks. I'm Michael Williams and I'm Secretary of the Lundy Field Society. We've had a good mix of new and long-standing viewers watching us this evening, so welcome to you all. I'm going to run through a few bits of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers, and later on I can tell you about the events coming up between now and Christmas. I'm back, as you can see, in the virtual Morisco Tavern. You can see it behind me, and I'm back now in Cambridge, having spent a wonderful 3 weeks on Lundy visiting the real thing. So moving on to our housekeeping arrangements. If you are a regular viewer, then please do make yourself comfortable while I go through the usual announcement. Only the microphones and video cameras on John's, Mandy's and my computers are enabled, so we won't be able to see or hear any of you watching at home. As ever, Dave Richards is behind the scenes hosting the Zoom session, and will make a recording available afterwards. If you're watching on Zoom, you are able to ask questions using the Q&A function. Just click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and then type your question into the box that pops up. If you're on a mobile or tablet, then you can find it on the menu bar. You'll also see that there's a chat feature for comments and feedback, which we'll be monitoring during the talk. And if you're joining us on YouTube, you're very welcome, but I'm afraid there's no facility for asking questions. We've had to change the format for tonight's session slightly. We had originally planned that both John and Mandy would be broadcasting live from Lundy. Unfortunately, the new lockdown has prevented this, but not before Mandy was able to spend a few days on Lundy this week and returning home to North Devon only earlier today. John has stayed at his home in the Northwest Highlands, so with me at home in Cambridge, we are coming to you from all corners of the country. John is going to give us an introductory talk to Lundy's fungi, and then Mandy is going to show us some photos of what she has found on the island during the week. So without further ado, I will introduce both of our speakers. I hope that we can get both Mandy and John on screen. There we go. Great to see you both. And thank you for joining us. So a few notes to introduce both John and Mandy. John has been interested in fungi since an early age, leading to an academic career as a mycologist at Aberystwyth and Westminster universities, publishing papers on fungal ecology, biotechnology and plant pathology. He's been coming to Lundy since 2003 to study the fungi in collaboration with other LFS members, resulting in a beautifully illustrated book, which I have here, Lundy Fungi, a photographic guide, co-authored with David George and published by the LFS. Mandy Dee first became interested in fungi as a teenager. While attending the Discover Lundy Week in 2016, she joined John for his fungus foray, which immediately rekindled her interest. Encouraged and supported by John, she has spent the last 3 years learning as much as she can about this fascinating kingdom, particularly the grassland fungi of Lundy and coastal North Devon. She's been a regular visitor to Lundy for the last 10 years and is a Lundy ambassador, leading guided walks, forays and sharing her love of the island. So without further ado, I'm going to hand us over to John for his talk. Over to you, John.
Right. Oh, hi. Am I on?
You're on, John. Yeah. Over to you.
Do I have to share screen? I do.
Yes.
Don't I?
Yeah, go for that.
Okay. Right. Okay.
That's great stuff.
All right, fine. Well, as Michael said in his excellent introduction, the main idea was to go to Lundy and to do a sort of virtual foray, looking for mushrooms and also displaying them and doing great fun things like making spore prints and so on online. Unfortunately, as you've heard, we couldn't make it. So there we are. So we're just going to do a virtual foray from Westeros and Devon. So I'll start and then Mandy will carry on. Okay, so usual thing in the autumn when I go to Lundy with Mandy is we also, with the Rosie, the assistant warden there, as you can see her on the right, we organise a foray. A notice is put out and people turn up in spite of often quite difficult weather and seem very enthusiastic. Okay, we usually start outside the tavern and I give a short 10-minute talk about fungi and why they're important on the planet and what we're going to find on Lundy. As you can see my audience there, some of them being browbeaten, I think. Well, one of the questions that gets asked are who studies fungi? We go back to Victorian times. We can see here's a page from the Hereford Fungus Eaters from the Graphic, a magazine published in 1873, with all sorts of activities going on there, very like a Lundy foray, except there are no trees on Lundy, or very few, and we don't have minions to help us climb branches to cut off toadstools and so on. Currently, of course, in the UK, we have the British Mycological Society, which is our preeminent and internationally famous Mycological Association, and also some very active local fungus groups. For example, there is one in North Devon. So what are these people looking at? They're looking at fungi. And why should one? Well, because they're quite important. They're a separate kingdom. They're not plants. They're made of a very tough polymer, chitin, very like you find in insects and crustaceans. And they grow by things called hyphae, which are organized into colonies, what you would say mold. On a pot of a jam is an example of colony. It could be small or large, and they eventually reproduce by forming spores. And sometimes those spores need quite complex fruit bodies, which, you know, top right there famously are mushrooms and toadstools, but they're rather in a minority actually compared with most of the millions of species of fungi on the planet, which are often very small. Now they lack chlorophyll and they gain nutrients by either decomposing plant material and so on. And I usually say underneath your feet on the lawn outside the Morisco Tavern, each gram of soil contains about 2 to 3 kilometers of these hyphae. They're very important in forming soil structure. So those decomposers, or even the ones living symbiotically with a green plant, like partner like grass or trees, that's another possibility. Or finally, they can notoriously parasitize plants, animals, and each other, but often in a quite benign fashion. I hope we'll see that in the talk. So how do fungi grow? Well, top left, you've got a fungus spore germinating. Then bottom left, you've got hyphae, these tubes growing across the plate there. And in the right-hand side, you can see a final form colony, this time of penicillium, which when I was making this presentation, I realized we'd never actually recorded from London. This is the thing, the blue mold on jam and so on. This sort of manifestation of the circular growth form, or spherical in liquid, you can see with lichens, which are a partner between an alga and a fungus, and there are many thousands of species. Nice circular pattern there. And then if we go up the top of Old Light, which is quite a famous landmark on Lundy, it's the lighthouse right on one of the highest points of the island, and we look out over the central plateau there, and this is Acklands Moor and the airfield, and we look in the airfield, and indeed everywhere on Lundy, we'll see that evidence of that circular growth pattern. Basically, it's just as if you threw a stone into a pond and watch the ripples spreading out. We've got the fairy ring champignon, makes it quite small rings on Lundy, but we get enormous rings of the wood bluet and the clouded agaric, some of them many meters across. Now, of course, that's ideal, but what would happen if a fungus is inside a log of wood, for example, a section through this piece of wood here, which is colonized by the turkey tail fungus. And if I can get that to go, what we see here are fungi growing in the wood, and I've got a time lapse of them growing on an agar plate, and you'll see where they meet. We're getting confrontation. We're getting these lines formed, and this is why very often when you see wood turners, they use this sort of wood. It's called spelted wood, and these black lines mark places where fungi are basically having territorial wars, and this looks a little bit like a map of the world, really, with different countries, each occupied with different fungus. Now, just to say before we go on that there are another growth form which is often called a fungus. It's not, and that's the Mycorrhizaes or slime molds. And these have an entirely different life cycle. They're related to the protozoans or protistans. And on the left, you see one of the things they do, which is forming a massive cell called a plasmodium, which crawls through the soil or wood. It's quite a monster, really, devouring as it goes bacteria and fungi. Eventually, it sporulates, it forms spores, looks a bit like a fungus, so it's got honorary title slime mold. About 500 British species. I think we've got 20 or 30 on Lundy. Okay, on our virtual foray, we can collect into something like this, a fisherman's tackle basket, and a very good place for storing and keeping separate. And when we get back to the house on Lundy, and this is my first visit in 2003, we can look at things down the microscope. Things have progressed since then, in that now Lundy has acquired a microscope, so much easier. We don't have to rely on bringing microscopes on and off the island. Well, one of the things I was going to Mandy and I are going to demonstrate was how you look at fungi. One of the things you can do with gill fungi is make these beautiful spore prints by upending the cap and letting the spores drop out, and you can keep them by sealing them with sellotape. Under the microscope, the important thing is to examine them, and every fungus has a slightly different spore, and that's a very important thing to do. Once you get slightly serious, you have to get a microscope. Another way of looking for fungi is to bait for them. Seems an odd idea, fishing, but in this case, we've put apples into water, and we're recovering aquatic fungi. It's actually not true fungus, it's called a chromiston, but there are quite a number of waterborne fungi you can get in this way. Okay, let's go and foray down in the Lundy Woods, see what's stirring in the woods. This is Milcombe Valley with one of the few places on Lundy with trees. Here's another, about 10 trees at St Helens Copse. So not much variety of woodland, but quite a lot of wood decomposing fungi on Lundy, especially temporarily on some of the felled rhododendron that was cleared on the east side. You can see on the right hand side there, Hypholoma, the sulphur tuft, and on the left you can see how these fungi sort of engulf the wood and suck it up and break it down and turn it back into carbon dioxide and water. Here's a fungus growing on a beech tree, the only one in quarter wall copse, beautiful porcelain fungus, and that's evidence the fungus inside rotting a branch on the tree. This one is the winter fungus. This is a rather late fruit, and most Lundy fungi are September through October, November. This one comes up in January, and it actually has in it an antifreeze which stops it freezing in very low temperatures. Fairy ink cap decorating the side of a rotting ash tree. This one turns to ink when it's finished, when it's discharging its spores. And here's one that Michael, your introductory host, found and sent me a picture of. It's actually in St Helens Church in the tower somewhere, and it's a stump fungus, a Sathirella stump brittle stem, growing, I suspect, on some wood incorporated into the stonework. Here's the oak maize gill growing on oak, and another type of fungus, jelly fungi, so called. This is jelly auricularia, growing on elder on the left and on the right on sycamore. And then another jelly fungus here, small stagthorn Colossera cornea growing on oak. Another type of fungus is here, dead man's fingers, so-called, which is quite hard and discharges its spores from little tiny flasks in the surface they can just make out, but even better in this one, which are related. And here are some of these flasks, a nice photograph by Mandy there, and the spores are shot out from little holes in the top. Another variant on this spore shooting is the yellow fairy cup here. Cup fungi have this shape, shoot their spores out into the air from the cups. Here's one which actually lives, and I found it quite excitingly, in a little stream on Lundy, one of the few streams running through the wood, and this lives underwater. Curious thing. Cellar cup doesn't. It was found by some time ago by Alan Rowland in the tractor shed. It likes living on plaster, so a variety of things there. Back to the slime molds, they're creeping in, their Plasmodium creeps everywhere, and they've crept into the presentation at the end. They also live on rotting wood. And here's one, the wolf's milk slime mold, Lycogula epidendrum. That was a Plasmodium, is now forming itself into a fruit body and will become brown and powdery in a matter of 24 hours or so. And here are some more lovely slime molds. I rather like them myself, turning into their fruiting structures. Bit bigger, but growing on soil in woodlands, is the stinkhorn, which is quite common on mainlands, only been found once on Lundy. And also more commonly, puffballs like the Lycoperdon pilatum here, common puffball. And also on the ground in the wood, we find quite a few of these boletes, which are tube mushrooms. They aren't decomposers. We'll come back to what they do. They don't rot, they do something else. We'll come back to that in a minute or two. And so do the milk caps. They are also common under trees on Lundy. Right, going away now from the very tiny area of Lundy, which has woodland, to the majority of the land area, which is grassland maintained by these super grazing by these ponies and other animals on Lundy. And it supports a tremendous variety of toadstools, and underneath the soil, the hyphae which are supporting those toadstools. For example, here, nice photograph of the parasol mushroom, and on the right at the bottom, the young stage. And finally, here we can see it in its very old form. It often persists on these Lundy windy plateau for weeks in this dried form. The clouded agaric, Clitosope nebularis, that's one of the ring formers I showed you. And here's the false chanterelle, Hydrophoroxis or Antiochus. Looks a bit like a real chanterelle, which we'll see later on, but is not related at all. And there are a number of mushrooms in the genus Agaricus, which includes Agaricus campestris, the field mushroom, but some of them on the Lundy Plateau have this interesting feature, like this species, of going pink when you scratch them. Wood bluet is another ring former species, which I showed earlier. And this is common on Lundy, especially it's a late season fruiter, grows in November, and is one of the fungi people like to eat, although it does contain slightly toxic compounds which are destroyed in cooking. St. George's mushroom, this grows at an odd time of year and not the autumn, but it's called St. George's mushroom because it comes out around about May, around St. George's Day, which I think is the 15th, I might be wrong there. Lots and lots of very tiny toadstools live in the grassland. For example, the bonnets and the moss cap on the right. and very tiny indeed is the hairy parachute, Crinipellis scabella, only a few millimeters across on the cap there. However, it wouldn't be any good giving a talk on Lundy if one didn't not talk about the highlight of Lundy, which are the wax caps, which are these very colourful gill fungi, which occur all over Lundy in November especially. There are, as you can see here, a variety of red and orange species, pink, white, yellow, and to date we've found over getting on for 38 to 39 species. It's the most diverse of all the Lundy fungi genera. Some of them not so colourful. Here's a nice photograph taken by Mandy of the slimy wax cap. It looks good because it shines, but it's got a shining because it's covered in slime. The pink gills, this is the blue edge pink gill, which are so cool because they do produce pink spores, nice pink spore prints sometimes. You just see on that right hand side of this blue edge pink gill, nice name for it. You see the edge to the gills there, pink in colour. And here is the commonest pink gill on Lundy, star pink gill, Entoloma conferendum. And we now move on to the puffballs, which cover the Lundy plateau in the autumn. They start off, as on the left, with a fleshy round structure, and eventually become leathery and can even blow around the plateau in the winds or end up on the beach as sort of tumbleweeds. They work by main raindrops hitting them and puffing the spores out. Another beautiful selection of fungi here from the grassland. These are all the club fungi, which have this sort of columnar structure, sometimes branched as the meadow coral there. And then apparently similar but entirely different group of fungi, the earth tongues. Black earth tongue on the left there, and green earth tongue, very rare on Lundy, only recorded once. Related in the same group of the fungi is this rather pretty cup fungus, which is nationally not that common and often occurs in rabbit burrows on Lundy for some reason. Just a word about something called chegg, and that is putting together all the numbers of fungi of the clubs, the wax caps, pink gills and earth tongues we've been looking at, and seeing what the total is. And the Lundy score is now 78, which is very good. And it's a way of emphasizing the conservation value of grassland. And because so many grasslands now have been destroyed by fertilizing and cultivation, these sorts of sites are getting increasingly rare in the UK. So well done, Lundy. Grassland also has its slime molds, and here's a rather unfortunately named one. Dog's vomit slime mold. It lives in the soil and then crawls out onto grass to sporulate. Right. The other thing about the grassland, it is covered in a copious supply of something a lot of fungi love, which is dung. And here we have some of these, which are gill fungi, the cone cap on the left and the fringe mottle gill on the right, growing out of pony dung. And there's a nice example of a toadstool there, Stropharia albicina, the peppery roundhead and the snowy ink cap on the right, all going on dung or very decomposed dung. And of course, that is why one has so many mushrooms on Lundy, both the field mushroom on the right and the horse mushroom, because they like soil enriched with the dung. Well, the other way of getting your food, if you're a fungus, is to make a symbiosis with another organism. And one of the things fungi do so well is produce an association with tree roots, or roots of all plants really, called mycorrhizaes. And a lovely example on Lundy is the creeping willow, which you can see here by Ponsbury, which in its roots on the right-hand side, the bottom there, are covered in fungus. And in the autumn, we know it's there because something like the coral brittle gill fruit bodies come up and are everywhere in the area. Sometimes you wonder how the tree so-called, the creeping willow, can support sort of size of fungus. On the left is a very large fleecy milkcap, and on the right, the sep or penny bun mushroom, as big as if they were growing, which they often do, with big trees. But there's something in it. The fungus gives the plant mineral nutrients, and in return, it gets lots of goodies, sugars from the plant, and that's why it can produce these large fruit bodies. And a lot of these fungi growing with a creeping willow, people who do forays will recognise as British common woodland fungi, the chanterelle, the roll rim, the marsh webcap on the right there grows with willow trees in the mainland. White coral is another of these partner fungi growing with a creeping willow. This one isn't. This one just grows in marshy ground and rots the reeds and leaf litter. It's the peat brownie, very pretty. Finally, we get to the north end of Lundy, which is a special habitat. Just to mention that it has in it two examples of a symbiosis. First of all is a thing called a basidia lichen, which is, most lichens are made with other sorts of fungi. In this case, it's the toadstool fungi or basidiomycetes that form an association. You can see here the fruit bodies, and at the background is this green sort of scum. That is the lichen, very delicate. And also at the north end, we have this one wax cap which grows up there, which is called the grey wax cap. And we have, over the past years, been surveying this, counting numbers of fruit bodies. And it is very interesting because it's more or less entirely restricted to the north end of Lundy, even though you find heather elsewhere. And we're still not quite sure. And we even did a DNA survey of it, looking at soil samples, which we can take, we're taking here. And Dr. Gareth Griffiths at Aberystwyth University confirmed that the only place you really find much of the DNA of this fungus is just at the north end. So we don't know. It must have an association with the roots of the heather. It must be a symbiosis, but nothing is known about it. Totally unknown. Quite exciting. Right. Finally, if you can't live in symbiosis, you can parasitize. There's lots of fungi in Lundy which are specialized to growing on living plants. Here's thistle rust on the left and hogweed powdery mildew on the right. It's that white. It's not whitewash. It's the fungus on the surface of the leaf. Not much damage to the plants. And even this nettle rust, although it looks quite fearsome with all the sporulating pustules along the stem, doesn't actually kill the host. Like this one, this is another one. This is the Anantha smut, and on the right you've got an uninfected flower, uninfected plant, normal stamens there. Left, instead of producing pollen, it's producing smut spores. But the plants look the same. They don't look very diseased, to put it that way. Right, well, this definitely does look diseased, and this is another opportunity for fungi being a parasite on insects. And this is probably the most spectacular example we've ever found, called Izaria farinosa, on a herald moth found in Benson's Cave, which is a famous Lundy landmark where slaves were kept. We won't go into that, but the herald moth, as I think you heard from Andrew's talk a few weeks ago about moths and butterflies on Lundy, likes to overwinter in dark places, but the penalty for that is you can get infected by this fungus, which is now sporulating, producing spores for the next infection. Oddly, some fungi parasitize other fungi. Two nice examples on Lundy. Yellow brain, which is familiar witch's butter, or another name for it, Tremella mesenterica, jelly fungus, grows on gorse, but it's not growing actually on the gorse, it's going on wood rotting fungi inside the gorse, other fungi. And on the right, Cladobotrium, that's another fungus that parasitizes wood rotting fungi. Okay, well, very briefly, here is the Lundy website, and we have a Lundy fungi list on it, which I hope people will be adding to in the future. How many species on Lundy now? 603 in the current list, and we get new records every time we visit. Even this time, I think Mandy's going to tell us of a few she got. I couldn't make it, but she did. And we got over 50 records last year alone. So there are many common mainland species yet to be found. So there's no reason why we couldn't actually get, I think the Devon list is about 3,000. So we're getting there, but obviously won't have that number because don't have variety of habitats. So records are needed, and this on the left is the lawyer's wig. Probably many people know that. Never seen on Lundy yet, so have a look out for it when you come over. The other thing which is of interest is we're beginning to find records now of new records of fungi which are slightly tropical. This one is Favolaskia, which I last saw in rainforest in Ecuador, and here it popped up on Lundy in 2018, found by Mandy Dee. Not a brilliant specimen, but nevertheless an extraordinary record of possible global warming. Okay, to start with, Michael mentioned the book, which took many years to produce with my co-author David there, and was ably edited by a Lundy Society member, Tim, and here it is on the left, and it is available and contains about 200 descriptions of about 250 species with photographs. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to my co-presenter Mandy.
Hello everyone.
It's all yours, Mandy, so please do go ahead.
Okay, hello. I'm having a few problems with the internet tonight, so I hope it doesn't cause too many problems. I've been very lucky to be able to get over to Lundy for the last few days. It should have been a week, so I had to come home early, unfortunately. But at least I've been able to get out and do a bit of fungus hunting. And I've got a few photos to show you of some of the things I found. I found over 50 species this week, which isn't very many to compare to most years, but with only myself and not John to help me, it's been a little more difficult. But it was still fun, and mainly concentrated on the grassland areas, so most of these are grassland species. I will now share my screen with you, and I hope that you can now see that. There we go. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a virtual foray around Lundy and to show you some of the things that I found. And you don't have to go far when you get off the helicopter to start looking for fungi. So I virtually dump my bag and go straight out into the camping field, through the camping field into the next field, which is the lighthouse field, and it's carpeted with wax caps. The white snowy wax cap, the yellow, golden and butter wax cap, the green parrot wax cap, and plenty of red ones too. Now these two, they may look the same, but they are actually two different species, and it was quite interesting to find them growing near each other. I did move these two close to each other to take a photo. So the one on the left is the scarlet wax cap, and the one on the right is the crimson wax cap. And if you look closely, the one on the left is a little shinier and a brighter red, and the one on the right is a little bit duller more waxy looking, and it has shades of sort of brown and orange. And the difference between the two becomes very obvious when you turn them over. And you can see now that the scarlet waxcap on the left is quite a mature specimen with but it's a much thinner stalk, and the one on the right is still actually quite a baby. It's still sort of half into a button shape. It's already got a great big thick stalk, showing shades of yellow with white stripes. So it really is quite different from the underneath. So that's the scarlet and the crimson wax caps. This is another of the wax caps that we find regularly on the grassland. This is the honey wax cap. It's orange all over. It's not called honey because of the colour though. It's because of the smell. So if you crush one of these up in your fist and then hold on to it for a few minutes so it warms up and the smell can get out, and then you sniff into your tight hand, that gives off a really nice rich honey aroma, and it's a good way of identifying it. So leaving the lighthouse field, and then go out into the southwest field where the grass is a bit longer and there's bracken as well. So we do get wax caps in this area, but we also find different fungi. This is where you'd find a lot of the parasols that John showed pictures of earlier. We also get dusky puffballs. This, you can tell these apart from the more common meadow puffballs, which are white, by the little clusters of spines that are growing all over. These are actually formed from little black hairs that point into each other to make these little spines. And as the puffball ages, they start to rub off, leaving little spots, a few of which you can see higher up there, and it leaves a mosaic pattern on the skin of the puffball. But if you notice that this fungus has a shortish stalk underneath, and this would help to raise it above the level of the grass, so that it can shed its spores above the level of the grass. But when the grass grows longer, you get puffballs like this with very long stalks. I've never seen one quite this long, but this poor puffball was trying to grow in the very long grass on Southwest Field and had to grow a really long stalk to raise itself up. This is another puffball that I found on Southwest Field. It does look like a rock, but it wasn't. It was a puffball. I was unfamiliar with this species, and I had to actually cut it open and take a sample from the middle and check the spores to see what it was. It turns out to be a black puffball, Bovista nigrescens, and I could tell that because the spores, they were little round spores, but they have a great big long beak sticking out, which is quite specific to this species, which was very helpful to me. So we also find these in the Southwest Field, these little pointy pixie hats. They're quite common all over the island. These are, of course, magic mushrooms, which do contain the psychoactive compound psilocybin, which makes them illegal to pick and to have in your possession. But they are very common. You can see, apart from the shape of the cap, they also have this distinctively wonky stem. And to forestall the inevitable question at the end, no, I haven't tried them. So we're going to leave the Southwest Field now and go out past up onto the airfield. Now the airfield used to be quite short turf that the sheep would keep it grazed down, but at the moment it's quite long. It is good for wax caps on the airfield, but with the grass a little longer, I didn't find many of the smaller species this year, like the snowy waxcap or the butter waxcaps, but there were plenty of the larger ones. This is a meadow waxcap, which starts as a round button, has a very dry apricot coloured cap. It would start as a round button, then open up to a flat fungus. But this one, with age, has inverted itself up into a funnel shape, which shows us the lovely thick waxy gills, which are characteristic of this family. Leaving the airfield, we're moving now over through Quarter Wall, out onto the grazed areas beyond. John showed you a picture of the ponies grazing. I've got a picture of the cows, and they keep the grass very short in this area, and this is where it's easier. And I found plenty of the smaller grassland fungi, lovely groups of the butter waxcap, small yellow discs, the cedarwood, which is the small white one, which smells of pencil shavings to me, and little red dots of the vermilion waxcap as well. And some of the very little club fungi. So this is an apricot club. You can't really tell from the colour in this photo. They do have a slight apricot tinge to them. Very common are the yellow clubs, which look a bit like this, but a slightly brighter yellow, and they tend to have a rounded top. It's easiest to tell them apart by looking at the spores under the microscope. So I did pick quite a few from various different places through the week and check the spores, and I found it was about 50-50 from the ones I checked. And I could usually tell them by the colour, and my guesses were correct as to whether they were apricot or yellow clubs. Also growing in the very short turf were these little white spindles. I haven't seen them growing in this area the last few years, though I know they've been found there before, but this year they were coming up everywhere, but in very short turf and only a few millimetres high. And the previous time when I have seen them on Lundy was when they were growing in one clump in the middle of the airfield, and there in the longer grass of the airfield they were several centimetres high, quite big. So it just shows again how fungi grow in different sizes in different habitats. Here's the meadow coral, looking just like a piece of sea coral. Once again, very short here on Lundy in the grazed turf, barely rising above the grass at all. If you found it in longer grass, and we do sometimes get it in longer grass on Lundy, it would be a much taller thing and much more loosely branched, so it would look quite different. One fungus I'm really hoping to find on Lundy one day, it looks very like this, but is a bright violet colour, the violet coral. It has been found on Lundy on the west side, and I do check that area every year, but unfortunately, yet again this year I couldn't find it. So I have been looking hard this year to find some of these earth tongues. John showed you a couple earlier. Last year these were plentiful, growing on all the verges, and everywhere you looked, if you looked closely, you could see a forest of these little black tongues. This year I only found 2 specimens and a couple of little tiny ones that were just starting to grow, so I think maybe they're going to be a bit late this year. This one is called the Deceptive earth tongue, and if you look at the stem you can see the sort of rough scales forming a sort of pattern on the stem, which usually means you can identify it from the macroscopic characteristics. But this is another thing where we usually do a bit of microscopy and take a sample and look at it under a microscope just to make sure that we know exactly what it is. This is the last fungus I've got to show you. I found this right on the cliff edge above Benjamin's chair of all places. It was quite dodgy taking a picture of it, so I had to be very careful not to move any further back, otherwise I'd have been over the edge. It belongs to a family called the Cavaliers, and we're not quite sure yet which one it is. It's very pale, but that may just be because it's faded. We've yet to pin it down to an exact species, but we've only found one Cavalier on Lundy, and it's not that one. So this is going to be a new species for Lundy, no matter what it is, which is exciting. So, well, I hope that's given you a bit of an idea as to what I found on Lundy this year, and what you might find if you come to Lundy in next autumn. Please do record any fungi that you do manage to identify, especially if they're violet corals. I'm going to hand you back to Michael now.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and thank you so much, John, as well. Fascinating talk and so many wonderful photos. There's been a few comments in the chat about how great it's been to see some of those fantastic photos. A very heavily illustrated talk, so thank you so much. For those of you watching at home, if you're on Zoom, don't forget we can pose questions to John and Mandy. You need to use the Q&A function at the bottom. I'm just going to use my prerogative and ask my own question to start with, which I'll ask you both actually. So, John, I'll go to you first. What fungus have you most expected to find on Lundy that you've not actually come across yet?
Oh well, I think actually everyone's favourite toadstool, which is the fly garrick, the one with red with white spots, and it would be so easy to see. So it must, why we haven't spotted it, I don't know. Must be there because we have some birch trees, it grows with birch, and then some of the other amanitas, with these classical toadstools, never seen on Lundy.
Mandy, what about you?
Well, one that I've had looked for the last couple of years, which I would like to find, is the Bracken Club, which is actually a teeny tiny little white thing that grows on decaying bracken stems. There's so much bracken on Lundy, it has to be there, but it's quite hard work looking for it. Well, not hard, because you just have to sit on a bracken covered slope and look at everything around you, but it would take a long time. I reckon it's there somewhere.
Thank you both. So we've got quite a number of questions coming in already, so I'm gonna get cracking and going through those. So the first question is Jennifer Baines, who says, I've noticed more fungi this year than I have before when I've been out and about on local walks, but sadly not on Lundy. Has this been the case for others, or is Jennifer just being more observant? Is it a good year for fungi? Andy, do you want to tell us what you think from your observations on Lundy recently?
Yes, it is a good year. Last year was a particularly good year as well, but we have had a few years before that where we had a very dry summer and into autumn, and that's bad conditions for fungi. They do need it quite damp. So, and once then if you get an early frost, then a lot of the fungi won't survive the frost. So you need the combination of a dampness through the sort of late summer into the autumn, but not having any early frosts. So yes, it has been quite a good year this year.
John, how are things in the northwest of Scotland?
Yes, just the same. Absolute bumper year. Terrific. Everywhere is, all the woods are covered in fungi. I think Mandy's right. We had a road. What these fungi actually need is a decent summer, just like us. And if they can have a decent summer and make plenty of growth, then they can, use that for making fruit bodies, which are the flowers of the fungi, in the autumn. But as I said in my talk, there are some which are a bit odd, and they don't do the autumn fruiting. They fruit in the spring. But I think she's right. It's a bumper year, but possibly down to a decent summer for growth as well.
Thank you both. Question from David Can. So, John and I've been out looking at anther smut funguses with you. We did this on Discover Lundy a few years ago. So David Can asks how many species have been found on Lundy of the smut funguses. Smut funguses.
I have to hold my head up and say and say the only ones we've found are the Microbacterium on the red campion. There should be another anther smut on the sea campion, and we've looked and looked on the flowers of it but not found it. Now, having said that, I'm remiss because there are a lot of species in the genus Entyloma, I never have pronounced it, which occur on things like sedges and so on. And I think, and even in the roots of plants. So I think we need to get down and look for these micro smuts in places like that. So the answer is no, only one that I've recorded, but more must be there.
Keep looking. Yeah. Thank you. A few comments we've got. Sophie Wellstood says, thank you, everyone. It was so interesting. Sue and Jim Maguire said, we're really enjoying tonight. And I think they're going to buy a copy of the book as well. Brian and Lita Woodcock send their greetings. Many thanks to John and Mandy for a fabulous talk. We did think of you this morning as we spotted a fungi on their lawn. I've got a question from Linda Blythe, who asks how many fungi are edible on the island. Which one of you would like to answer that?
Shall I?
Go ahead,
Is that
John.
right, Andy?
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question. Lundy is a bit of an oddball because it depends where you pick them, because most of the area beyond Quarter Wall is a triple SI, so you shouldn't pick because it's under conservation measures. But it's difficult to say about edibility, really, because it's a question of really checking the fungus in the books and making sure it's the right fungus. I think of all the fungi on the island, obviously the most obviously edible is the parasol. But and I know some people who come on the Forays are very keen parasol consumers and like it very much. But I wouldn't have said, and there's obviously the field mushroom, the horse mushrooms, and so on and so forth. But the converse is true. I wouldn't have said there's anything that's terribly poisonous on Lundy. Probably the exception is the false fairy ring fungus, Tytosabe rivulosa, because that looks a bit like the fairy ring champignon and is poisonous. So the answer is really, you've got to know your fungi and you've got to make sure you've identified them properly before you go ahead and eat. The wax caps are all edible except for the Hygroscopy conica, the blackening wax cap, that is poisonous.
Thank you. Thanks, John. So I think it is worth reiterating your point earlier on that north of the quarter wall on Lundy is a triple SI, so you shouldn't be taking the mushrooms from the island anyway, in that part of the island. Okay, we'll move on. A question from Justin D. Is this a relation to yours, Mandy? And in fact, a question for Mandy: is there a big difference of the fungi on Lundy as compared to the North Devon coast?
No, actually, the areas of the coast around here where I go looking for fungi are actually quite similar. Mort Point, which is my nearest little bit of coastland, just to the west of Ilfracombe, has a very similar range of wax caps and things. And some of the, I haven't found quite as many, but I think that it's very similar. Yes, it just needs a bit more time. I spend too much time on Lundy and not enough time on the mainland, I think.
Thank you. We've got a question from Zoe Boardman, a technical question here. In your opinion, from observations, is the genus Hygroscopy, is that how you pronounce it, flourishing on Lundy? And how does this year compare to previous years?
John?
Who would like to? John, would you like to take that?
Oh, me? Oh, okay.
John, want to answer that one?
Sorry?
Go ahead, John.
Okay. Flourishing on Lundy, yes. Well, the reason it flourishes on Lundy is what it's been managed really in the interest of conservation and grazing. And so the areas that wax caps love are undisturbed grassland, where they can build up the diversity of the wax cap community. It's interesting that actually even on the improved fields around the village, you still get quite a few wax caps, but the commonest there is the snowy wax cap, which is pretty tolerant of any agricultural improvement. But certainly there are a number yet to be found. I mean, I think Mandy can tell us about one which she found on the North Devon coast, which we've got to get for Lundy, haven't we?
Yes, I was very lucky this only a couple of weeks ago to go out to a good wax cap grassland on the North Devon coast and find a blushing wax cap, Hygroscopy ovina, which is quite rare, and we have yet got to find it on Lundy, but it's big and obvious, so it's not something we've missed. If it was there, we'd have found it, so it's just a case of looking harder every year until it pops up.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you. I'll move on. We've got loads of questions to get through. Leslie Armstrong asks, she says, lovely photos. We were due on Lundy next Monday, so this talk would have been very apt. Now going in March, will there be any fungi at that time of year?
Me or Mandy?
Go for it, John.
Well, yes, there will be. Yes, go, yes. You will get lots. They're going to be possibly, you might see, for example, remnants of things like the winter fungus and so on. There are a number of, they won't be as good really as the big autumn ones, but if you look carefully, you'll find a lot of micro fungi growing on wood, things like jelly fungi and so on still be about. But for me, it's the time because I find loads and loads of tiny little jobs all over the leaves and the twigs and so on, because what they're doing is they're getting ready to shoot their spores to infect all the plants and leaves as they're coming out in the spring. So if you've got a microscope and a hand lens, you're going to find a lot of fungi. If you're looking for big toadstools, I dare say you're going to be disappointed.
Thank you. Hope that answers the question. A question which is probably for Mandy. Hugh Evans asks, how can we get to Lundy for a Lundy Fungi foray, COVID permitting?
Well, the island is now shut, for the next month, obviously. Then it'll be open for a couple of weeks till Christmas. But it'll be open again in mid-January, I believe. It's going to open a bit earlier than normal. So after that, then there will be opportunities to go and stay on Lundy. But if you want to see the sort of wax caps and things from this that we've been showing on this talk, then you need to book for next autumn, anytime sort of from mid-September onwards, right the way through up till Christmas, to see the best display.
And if you can time your visit for when John and Mandy are both there, you'll have a great time. John, you want to add something?
We usually go first week in November, don't we, Nandy?
There we go, Hugh. So if you book a holiday to Lundy for the first week of November, you can join John on a fungi foray next year. I've got a couple of questions here. There's a question from an anonymous person who, and a question from Peter Clabburn. Peter asks, have the new species always been there, just not found, or are they brought in by wind-blown spores?
Yeah.
And then the other question is, if some new fungi are arriving because of global warming, may others depart? John, do you want to take those questions?
Oh, really difficult one. I don't think anything's going to depart yet, but one could imagine that, for example, if the climate got so hot and maybe dry, things like the plants changed, then fungi are very likely to change too, because they're dependent on the plants, especially those I was talking about, which is a helper fungi and grow with the roots of the trees, and especially with that creeping willow, because if the creeping willow went, a lot of fungi would go. But it is going to happen, yes. So if we got arrival of Mediterranean species, that means the climate is getting more Mediterranean, and we'll have a departure of northern species. Difficult to depict what would happen. What was the other question? Sorry, it was two, weren't there, Richard?
It's about the impact of the global warming, and then whether things are brought on by wind-blown spores.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, the other thing that you say is, mycologists always say everything is everywhere. So I've just taken a breath. I probably pulled in about 1 or 2 fungal spores. This lab is very moldy anyway, but they're everywhere in the air, and they land all the time, and 99.99% they don't do anything. They germinate and die. But so all the time Lundy is receiving spores from the mainland, and vice versa, Lundy's giving out spores back to the mainland. So there's an interchange. So whether things grow on Lundy or not will depend on the habitat, not so much on arrival of particular spores. However, with that case of that orange fungus, which Mandy found, that is definitely moving. Its spores are coming north and finding they can germinate, they can succeed because it's warm enough. And so that what will happen is things will move north from Mediterranean regions and so on with the spore rain. But it's the climate change which is allowing them, not the fact that the spores themselves are suddenly becoming global or moving around.
Thanks, John. We'll move on. Loads of questions still to get through. So Richard Breeze asks, hello, Richard. Why can some fungi only grow on dead trees rather than living trees?
I feel that Mandy's not answering any questions here.
I'll come to Mandy in a moment. I've got a question for Mandy lined
up.
Have
you? Okay. Well, it's quite simple. Because some fungi are what I would call saprotrophs. That is, they need a dead wood and they break it down. They invade from the soil or what have you, as these sorts of, we saw the initial sequence of these hyphae, these molds growing across. So they would be invading dead trees. But even living trees have inside them fungi, which are called endophytes, and they sit in there and wait for a branch to die, and then they break out and rot it. And that's a very good example is that porcelain or beech tuft fungus we saw on the beach, the white one, shiny one. So they're adapted. The ones that are attacking living trees are, I suppose you could say, what they're pathogens. But the ones that are just waiting there and then breaking down dead wood, they're just decomposers. But there's a fine line between the two.
A question for Mandy then from Sarah Swindle, who says Lundy is a bit of a harsh environment. We certainly know that. It was pretty harsh when I was on Lundy in the tail end of October. Do you get more fungi species on the sheltered eastern side?
You do, the woodland fungi, certainly you get on the sheltered eastern side because that's where the woods are. But actually the wax caps that occur on the shorter grassland areas, you get those on both sides of the island. There's just as many growing on the sort of the short grass going areas near the earthquake as there are on the short grass areas near the ruins on the other side. So it doesn't seem to have a huge amount of difference, no. So it depends, they grow in the right habitat regardless of whether they're in the windy side of the island or not.
And I've got a follow-up question which sort of joins that question to the previous question about the dead wood. A question from Tim Hambley. How important are fungi in getting rid of the dead rhododendron stumps on the east side of the island?
Super important. I mean, they really are. I mean, I'm amazed. I mean, I went to Lundy first in 2003, and they were just starting the clearance. In some areas now where the first clearances took place, you can't find stumps. I mean, it's all been totally rotted by the fungi. And the main one that does it is the sulphur tuft. I think we showed a picture of it, nice yellow toadstool. And that does seem to, it just turns the wood into a pulp, which then gets washed out and turned into humus. So they're doing a great job, yes. In my opinion, none of the rhododendron wood should be harvested and fed into the tavern fire. It should all be left there to rot and produce lots of interesting fungi. And including, there's a one which grows on it now called Perenniporia ochroluca, which is again a Mediterranean species that's turned up on Lundy. And it does very nicely on rhododendron wood, although I don't think it's ever seen a rhododendron where it comes from in the Mediterranean.
Thank you, John. A couple more comments. We've got Mike and Danielle Young say, we really enjoyed our evening with you locked down here in Wales. Thank you very much. We feel inspired to visit Lundy next year. So thank you for the message. I've got a message from Carol Lee. Hello, Carol. I hope you had a good time on Lundy this week. Apart from humans, do any other animals commonly eat fungi? Now, we saw the ponies and the Highland cows in your photos. Do any of the other animals eat the fungi? Mandy, do you want to take that question?
Sorry, I didn't hear that one, but we had a glitch in my internet.
Apart from humans, do any other animals commonly eat fungi?
Yes, I believe they do. I think that John will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe some of the fungi spores will actually pass through the animal's digestive system and come out the other end to then germinate in the cowpats and things. But slugs particularly love fungi. So slugs and small insects and things are always devouring them. But it does seem like a lot of the grazing animals on Lundy will leave the larger fungi alone. The sheep will knock them over, but they don't seem to get eaten. So I think it's the smaller ones, the spores get ingested on the grass as the animals graze. But the actual larger fungi don't seem to be eaten by the grazing animals at all. John, any more to add to that?
No, you're perfectly right, Mandy. Absolutely right. Yeah, I know squirrels on Lundy. Squirrels, rodents love. You know, they will even eat death caps with impunity. Squirrels.
I'll move on to a question from Margaret McLaughlin, who says, do the fungi families relate in any way to the types or numbers of lichen on the island?
Wow.
John, do you want to answer that?
One. Wow, Margaret McLaughlin, eh? Yes, a technical question there. Well, families of, well, yeah, I mean, most of the lichens on Lundy belong to the same families, or related to anyway, although it's rather complicated, the the cup fungi I showed. But in fact, I think what you're saying here is, are the same fungi involved in making lichens as are sort of living on rotting wood and on soil and so on? And the answer is no. The ones that are involved in making lichens with an algal partner are entirely distinct. They may be related to the free living ones that, you know, are decomposing and living outside of a lichen relationship, but then they're never the same. You don't find a lichen fungus which then starts to eat wood or what have you. So they are specifically lichen, lichenicolous, lichen forming fungi. I hope that answers it. It's a complicated question.
Yes. I'll ask a nice easy question now from Bob Gardner. Hello, Bob. We were on Lundy in October and took several pictures of fungi wherever we found them. Would John or Mandy want to see the pictures we took and know where we found them? And where would he send them to? So I suppose it's really a question of, do we want John to email them across to us, or should we ask John to post them up on Facebook, and then Mandy and other people can identify them? What do you think, Mandy?
Facebook is a good place to put photos, so that I could see them and have a look. But they do need to be quite good photos. It's quite hard to identify a little brown job taken at 10 paces. So if you have good photos, particularly if you've managed to get a photo, you know, showing the gills and the stem as well as the cap, then it'd be worth having a look at them. If you do have any records of fungi that you've actually managed to identify using John's wonderful book, then they could be written into, traditionally they would be written into the logbook, which is in the tavern. But of course, during COVID regulations, you can't actually access the logbook because it's a hotspot for viral infection. So they instead have a collection of loose sheets, which they ask you to fill in any records that you have, and then those are collected and will be collated. So for identified fungi, then the records into the tavern, please. Or if you've rediscovered some records of something afterwards, once you've left, then you could email them into the warden.
Thanks, Mandy. Rob Robson asks, has there been a general survey of fungal DNA on Lundy? Another technical question there.
I know this man. He's a rather good molecular biologist, microbiologist, so I would expect him to ask that. Well, all we've done so far, Rob, is we've looked at this grey wax cap, which is the Hygroscopy lacmus. And obviously with DNA libraries, you can pick out from samples from soil, you can pick out the DNA of that fungus. But of course, when you're doing that, when you're looking at these cDNA libraries, you can see a lot of other things in the library which light up with your DNA extract. And so the odd thing is that we have, with the work that we did on the grey wax cap with Dr. Gareth Griffith of Aberystwyth University, we also found that presence on Lundy of fungi which we've never seen as fruit bodies. So in other words, they're hidden. They're living in the soil as these hyphae, as these growths I showed you, but never fruiting, or they're fruiting the naughty things when we're not there. So there are a number of waxcap species, for example, which we know are there as DNA, probably, but we've never seen as fruit bodies. So it's a good question, and I anticipate in 50 years' time, possibly we won't do forays, we will just collect bits of soil and environment and then run the DNA and say, oh, they're all species. Very boring.
I hope that answers your question, Rob. Good. We've still got a few questions outstanding, but we're also running out of time. So I'm going to ask the last couple of questions now. Mandy, would you like to take this question, which is from Mike Towers, who asks, well, he says he's coming to Lundy the week before Christmas, lockdown permitting. What should he be looking out for, fungi-wise?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Well, if Lundy doesn't tend to get frost, so if there haven't been any frost, then imagine that a lot of the fungi that we have shown you here today will still be on the island, and you maybe even more. As I say, some of the things like the earth tongue seem to only still be getting going at the moment, so there may be even more of those around than there are at the moment. And I did find some of the wood bluets, which form the big fairy rings on the southwest field, and they're particularly late species, so they might be getting quite prevalent by then as well. So there should still be plenty to see.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Can I
John?
just say, I've been on Lundy, unfortunately, in January. It was very cold, but we found lots of wax caps. So they do, as Mandy says, because it's so mild, they'll carry on fruiting right through to February. Mainland, they've all disappeared.
Thank you both. Before I ask you the last question, just to pick up a few more messages of thanks. So Carol Waring says, thank you for an interesting talk, very, very enjoyable. Liz Lee Furbank says, thanks for an interesting talk from Dartmoor. And this final message of thanks is from Becky MacDonald Loft. So Becky was a warden on the island. Yeah. She says, great talk, lovely to see you all, miss your fungal forays. Becky and Lofty. So the last question is from our very own Dave Richards, who asks, who mentions the fungi which develop in rings. What causes the ring structure? John?
Well, I mean, I think that there are people that work in mycology who work on something called fractile geometry. And they look at this sort of structure. It's very interesting. And you can model it mathematically. But basically, the simplest idea is that it just is something starting from a central point, which is where the spore lands, and then growing outwards in all directions at exactly the same rate. So you will get a perfect ring. But obviously, that doesn't happen in nature. So these rings are always slightly deformed. But in grassland, they're often almost perfect. They eventually die out and turn into arcs. But if you actually put a fungus into water and let it germinate, it would make a ball because it would grow out the same rate in all directions. So it is just that factor of the margins growing at the same rate all the time. So you get a circle. But as we saw in the wood, if they hit another fungus, then all hell breaks loose and you get these fungus wars and all sorts of black zones and so on occur, and all sorts of odd shaped colonies because they stop each other. Lichens do this as well on rocks and on even on trunks. You know, you see when they touch each other, there's black lines form, they stop growing. Very rarely get a perfect circle in nature.
Thanks for that, John. I'm sorry to the people who have not been able to pose your questions, but I hope that's given a sort of a good range of questions to complement the fantastic talks and slides that we saw at the very start. I'm going to start to wrap up now. Just to mention again John's book. I posted in the chat that you can go on, John.
It's a joint authorship with David George, John Hedger and David George.
I can't show it very well because of my virtual background, but yes. So it's joint authorship between John and David George. If you'd like to buy a copy, I posted the link in the chat earlier on. So it's available on the LFS website. Talking of the LFS website, just a reminder that to get my plug-in, please support these talks by joining the Lundy Field Society. Membership is open to all. You can find out more by visiting the website, which is up on the screen, or visiting us on social media. We now also even have an online form on the website, so that should make joining even easier. We've got a couple more talks coming up before Christmas. So on the 17th of November, Josh Harris is going to be joining me to talk about his wildlife photography. Those of you members of the Lundy Island Facebook page will have seen some of Josh's fantastic photos on the website. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some of those brilliant photos that Josh takes. Sue Sayer and Kate Williams of the Cornwall Seal Trust are joining me on the 1st of December to talk about Lundy's seals. And then we're holding the Morisco Tavern quiz. So a very different event to take place just before Christmas. And we're going to have a quiz. And then on the 12th of January, John Hedger will be joining me to follow up from his photography workshop from the spring. And if you haven't seen John's workshop with Philip Limbury, then you can catch up with it on the Discover Lundy YouTube channel. Of course, all these are subject to change, so I'll let you know if anything changes. And as usual, I will send an email out to LFS members about the talks and post information about them on the Lundy Island Facebook page, but everyone is welcome. You don't need to be an LFS member to join us. So, as usual, at the end of this session, you'll get a feedback survey. So I'm really grateful for all the feedback that we've been getting from previous talks. So please do spend a minute or two sending me your comments afterwards. Thank you very much. Also, my thanks to Dave Richards, who's been hosting us again this evening. Thank you to our two speakers for their really informative and beautifully illustrated talk this evening. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mandy. And it's just really now time to say goodbyes. So, John, would you like to say cheerio?
Cheerio, thanks for watching, and thank you, Dave, for hosting so well, and Michael for plugging the book.
It's a pleasure. Mandy?
Thank you all. If anyone would like to see any more of my fungi pictures, then I'm on Instagram at devon.fungi.girl. And if you see me on the island flat on my face with my camera pointed at a fungus, do come up and say hello. And I hope to see you all on some proper forays in the future. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you everybody at home for watching. I hope you can join me when we have our next webinar. But until then,